Hello, and welcome to episode 9 of Overshadowed. Today, we'll be talking about data and identity, the new edge in modern security organizations. With me today is Steve Zalewski, the former CISO of Levi Strauss and current CISO advisor to companies large and small. Steve, great to talk with you today.
Russ, thank you. It's great to see you again.
It's nice to see you as well. We've always had great conversations. I'd be remiss to not also mention that you are the co-host of the famous CISO series Defense and Death podcast, which I listen to regularly and always get great information out of. But today, really wanted to pick your brain. You've been a security advisor and a security operational leader at companies like PG&E, Kaiser Permanente, Levi Strauss, and really wanted to get your understanding of sort of that evolution that you've seen over your career, where you've gone from a traditional sort of network edge to using data and identity as sort of the modern edge. Can you tell me a little bit about that experience?
Yes, happy to. So, in my experiences here, right, and working at large companies and advising with small, I try to find simplified way of defining the problem for us as CISOs and in communicating our problem set right to our stakeholders. And the way I look at this is 20, 30 years ago when we had on-prem, okay, and that was primarily how we built data centers. We decided, where is our edge? Where's our defense going to be? Where are we putting all of our money? And the network edge was the logical place to do it. Okay, so we can have a hard edge and a soft center, so to speak. And so we built out a lot of controls on the network edge where there's firewalls and routers and switches and did all that. Okay. And then we realized once we had that, when you made it through our edge, then identity became critical, because who has access to what for business roles, for IT roles, became the natural center of the security universe, right? So identity and access management and the life cycle for that. And all was good. And then the cloud came. And all of a sudden, with the cloud came the ability to move everything out there. And so now everything that was this really nice, hard network edge that was in my data centers became everything in the cloud. And those were SaaS or IaaS or PaaS for those that are familiar. Okay. And then the exercise became, well, do I try to introduce a network edge into all of that? Or do I understand that really now what I have is a data edge? Because the services from a third-party risk, okay, are being protected by the companies I have contracts with. And now what I have to do is manage the flow of the data. So I end up with the data edge. I tell people, so your service edge now is network in one case. If you're going out in the cloud, you really have a data edge exercise. Okay. And what does that look like? But then, right, you also have to introduce hybrid, where people have your on-prem data center and they're in the cloud. Many large companies have that. Okay. And now the question becomes, when I do hybrid, I still have to do identity and access management, but I have one set of capabilities for the on-prem. And now, what does identity and access management look like when it's not me focused on the person like you, Russ, but it's a data edge? And so I kind of had this very simple model that says you have a network edge, you have a data edge, and you have an identity edge. And you have to understand what your capabilities are for those and kind of what your responsibilities are for a company to know where to put your energy into those three service edges that makes the most sense for you.
It's a really great way to put it, and it's so interesting. My last experience was obviously at a very network-centric company working for a large telco after the last company I was working at got gobbled up. And that network edge was such a critical focus, but I saw the balance even over the course that I was there and since having conversations with people since then, where they started to focus more on that data and identity edge because they recognized that that network control only extended so far in the modern sort of security world. As you kind of think about the sort of balance and priority between those three, how do you kind of think about that or advise people to sort of, how many eggs do you put in each basket as you kind of make your plan for defense?
So it's one of the things we talked about for you and I, which was the first thing is, as a good engineer, break the problem down. So the
Yeah.
fact that we're having this conversation around what a service edge is. How do I provide the business services that I as a CISO, okay, have to be able to protect for my company to sell more jeans, like I used to say at Levi's. Okay. And so one option, and many CISOs do this, right? And there's nothing wrong, is what you do is you try to replicate your network edge into the cloud. So therefore, if I'm using Palo Alto networks or Fortinet or whatever, right? Whether it's physical devices or virtual, then when I'm going into the cloud, I'm going to use the corresponding virtual devices because I'm going to try to establish a hard network edge because I put a lot of money and time and effort into maturing that, right? That's what my security team does. And that's how I can meet the commitments to the company, right? To protect the company and demonstrate the evidence of compliance for governance, risk, and compliance. Okay. If you're a if you're a SaaS company, okay, meaning you build product that's based in the cloud native applications, and the rest of that stuff, right? A network edge, it becomes interesting because you really don't have one. So VPNs and stuff don't actually become relevant. So you have this opportunity to rethink the problem. And that's where it's all right, SaaS data edge and this identity edge, okay, becomes more than provisioning people to business applications, right? It's an appreciation that the identity extends beyond human. Now it extends to assets and it extends to data, okay? And it extends to APIs because you're realizing now you're trying to manage the movement of data where the company is simply saying you can't stop it. But I don't have the right identity and access management maturity for the cloud to be able to support these types of identities and this type of authentication authorization requirements.
It's really interesting to hear you say that because I think about the security model that we run at Nudge, right? Our networking equipment extends to a managed Wi-Fi router. I bought all of our employees, and that's it. We don't have anything else. And of course, having the benefit of being a small, scrappy startup and being able to build security from the ground up, that's the reality. But you'd be surprised at how many SaaS companies have a similar story, and even ones of hundreds or thousands of employees where they really don't have much more than Wi-Fi access points as a result of that. But your description is such a great one because I can see how that legacy mindset really tugs as companies have to deal with that hybrid reality.
Yep.
And it's really challenging for people to kind of make that leap towards how do I do identity first, data first, service edge protection. And it's really a constant evolution that people have to make. How do you think about sort of establishing those priorities and helping people sort of make that leap in the work that you do as kind of an advisor or conversations that you've had?
Yeah, and this is something that we've been talking about, and I'm not. This isn't a commercial for Nudge, but I want people to understand that this is where we're going, right? Which was, all right, now that you understand that identity and access management is not just the provisioning lifecycle of a person to a business application, and then business role-based access control to figure out what entitlements you have. That historically has been what we spent a lot of time and energy doing. Okay. And you can argue we've been somewhat successful at doing that. But now that we had to pivot to what we're talking about here, okay, how do I do authentication and authorization for types of identity that I haven't historically had to consider? So if you put your engineering hat on, what you're simply saying is if I look at my tech stack and my solution architecture, I'm having to introduce identity and access management controls in different places. and through different mechanisms, which is where we need this innovation. And so you're seeing this innovation with companies like Nudge that are understanding what does authentication and authorization look like, not as a hard edge, but as a realization that I need to have context to determine what is the data at this point in time moving between two endpoints, only one of which I probably trust, and trying to determine if it's appropriate to let that data move. And I'm kind of using real-time data and contextualization to be able to see that I'm going to be mostly right most of the time.
It's the other thought that just kind of struck me, and obviously it's a piece that I'm constantly learning more about. But I started Nudge because one of the things that we recognized was, in that traditional network edge, IT and security owns all of those assets. For they're probably the ones that plugged them in, that plugged in the Ethernet cables and set up the architecture. But exactly as you just described, when you're moving to that network, that identity edge, there's all these places where that long tail of accounts that have been created, that long tail of places where people are dropping their data around the internet is outside of traditional control. And woe on me for having this realization so late. But that's part of the challenge that we're dealing with now, which is like, all of a sudden, not only are we dealing with new paradigms of how to protect things, but we're having to stretch ourselves far beyond the traditional boundaries that we established, right? And that evolution as a security leader is a real challenge to not only step up for new techniques, but step up for new responsibilities. And that's really, I think, a piece of what the industry is struggling with right now.
And I like that you say this is not, it's an evolution. Okay. We're not talking revolution. CISOs cannot do revolution, right?
Yeah.
We budgets are tight, right? Our ability to stop attacks and the commitments we've made for the last 5 or 6 years have put us in a situation that we have to evolve. Okay. But that evolution that we're talking about, right, is an appreciation for service edge. It's an appreciation for, you need to be able to go back up and say, look, we're heavy on the network edge. That's not bad, right? We have an identity edge. Okay. And I have a data edge. And to your point, where do I prioritize the investment? Okay. And where do I have to innovate? Where I've got to bring in some new tools as opposed to being able to just get further value out of my existing tool set. And nobody wants to buy more tools. Okay. Which then leads us to what you and I talked about, Russell, which is, so is my job to try to prevent attacks from happening? Okay. Or is my job to protect my company, where I realize that attacks are going to be successful? And so therefore, I have to look at thwarting attacks, and I have to move from what are my vulnerabilities to what are my exploitabilities, and then what are material exploitabilities, and use my identity and access management edge, right, to contextualize, to be able to determine that, because I can't say no. I have to let the data move, but I have to do it in a way that with that context, I will eventually key into the fact that this is either malicious or accidentally moving, and I can take action. And not
Absolutely.
have this expectation that I can just absolutely prevent it because I'm going to put multi-factor authentication everywhere.
We're still working on that particular challenge. It's really great to hear you kind of describe it that way, because that evolutionary process is one that we're going to have to do every day, and sometimes it feels like it's evolving faster than we're evolving, right? which is part of the challenge, but also part of the excitement that we have here. But the area that really kind of excites me when you talk that way is about that constant shift in terms of where we're going to find this, the scope of our security programs. Because one of the areas that I've run into a few times is and perhaps a little bit derisively call it the scope of convenience, right? Which is I have a data security program and it's scoped to the database that I have locked down in my data center. And nobody's obviously that hyperbolic, but usually it's sort of like the 3 or 4 systems that they have concrete controls over, but a little bit of a blind eye to the reality that that data is also propagated around everything else that's connected to those systems. And that's where I see a real opportunity for us to quickly evolve as an industry to start to recognize how broadly our data has gone out there and start to do more defensive actions around the broader set of these data stores that exist.
Yes. And so as companies, right, and as security practitioners are kind of looking at this, right, we're getting comfortable with this. Well, now the conversation becomes, well, what's my first line of defense and what's my last line of defense? Okay, because I will still manage vulnerabilities and I still need to prevent. Okay, but we also know that we're going to get leakage. So therefore, what's my last line of defense? And the interesting thing around identity like this is when we start to look at the context of authentication and the context for when an authorization is occurring in near real time, is the fact that we're looking at additional variables and we're trying to determine the likelihood, right, of whether this is a good request or a bad one, is we're starting to implement a polymorphic defense. We're starting to also not look at our defensive perimeter as a set of static policies, okay, and ports and protocols. And we're doing what the bad guys are doing to us. They're probing our defenses 1,000 different ways, waiting for a mistake. Well, now what we're starting to do from an identity perspective is applying context that they don't understand what all that context is. We're looking at the asset, we're looking at the application, we're looking at the user, we're looking at the data, and we're determining what does normal look like, okay, in a dynamic way, so that when something looks outside of norm, then we're alerted to that, which means we're not exactly sure when we're going to trigger on it, but it means the bad guy can't either. So I've got a polymorphic defensive perimeter. So all of a sudden I have this last line of defense that's operating, okay, that is thwarting the bad guys, making it harder for them, and they'll go somewhere else. Okay, so I look at this really as we're kind of raising the weaponization of defense by looking at identity and access management this way, and where the data edge has actually allowed us to kind of step up our game, both for innovation and as we deploy this, our ability to do this polymorphic defensive concept.
It's interesting. So pulling on my past life in security analytics, there was never any sort of absolute bad events that we would generate, right? We would just say, these are things that you need to look at yesterday, or these are things you can look at tomorrow. But when you map that into the sort of authentication authorization world, those are traditionally depicted as binary decisions, right? This is good, this is bad, this user has access, this user does not. But the way you just described it is, this is something you need to look at now. This is something you need to look at tomorrow. And it really maps itself nicely to a lot of the traditional methods that we've used in more traditional security analytics into that identity space, because you're absolutely right. This needs to be a little bit more of a flexible model, but it's one that also needs to be more dynamic in order to detect where people are actually getting exposure and access to things that they really shouldn't be.
And the key here is, and it's not people, it's identity. It's an identity is getting access to something, because historically we talk about people, right? And that was why when we talk about the data edge and now this identity edge, is it's not a person, it's something, and we're determining the appropriateness of the access. And that's what's so fascinating about this, right? Which was, we understand authentication authorization. We're just implementing it at different locations in the stack, and we're bringing in additional context, okay? And machine learning and AI, as much as I hate to say that, has matured enough that we can bring in all of that additional context and do near real-time risk evaluation based on policies and what we see, right? And the thread of what normal looks like. And that has been long time coming, and we're now on the cusp of being able to evolve that way. And this is what you and I talk about with Nudge is you're part of that enablement. Okay. You're part of that movement for security practitioners and others to understand that 80 to 90% of all successful attacks have a compromise of an identity. That's mandatory for them to succeed, right? I used to say, or I still say, the bad guys don't break in, they log in.
Right.
Right. And so, given that that's true, okay, it's not really about 0 days. It's about kind of blocking and tackling of identity as we've now moved where we can do that. And so, therefore, as we implement and talk about it this way, people start to understand it's last line of defense. It really is for what we're doing. And anything we do is better. Okay, maybe I can only stop 1% initially as we do this, but that's a 1% that I'll always stop. So
Right.
that dollar spent is paying back for the next 5 years. Okay, and that's what's so exciting is what we're doing with this polymorphic defense, right? Is creating a way kind of mathematically to remove some of the ways that the guys are playing chess against us, right? And we're looking at it more like checkers. It's more discrete now. We're taking away some of those attack vectors and we're making it harder. And now we have a chance.
We always used to have the sort of pyramid of threats, right? Users doing stupid things, broad-based attacks, nation states, right? And the reality is everybody thinks they're targeted by nation states, but the most often it's users doing stupid things and broad-based attacks. And so exactly as you say, if we can retire risk on the bottom of that pyramid, we massively reduce our attack surface and increase that cost for somebody to actually exploit. And I really like how you phrase that in the identity space there as well, because it's absolutely the way, well, my belief, and it seems like we share that belief, that is one of the biggest opportunities for us to improve things going forward.
Okay. So, and again, hopefully the audience is enjoying this, Russ, right? Which was, it's not opportunity to improve. Okay. We must improve. This is not, it's fun to do it. Here's innovation. It's the attackers are being ever more successful. They are weaponizing some of this new generation of technology more effectively than we can weaponize it for defense. Okay. And so what we're trying to figure out is, all right, where's our innovation to weaponize our defense to stop the improvement of attacks? And since identity is the weakest link and they're doing it, what's so interesting here is now we're focusing on identity for defense, right? And some polymorphic here to be able to identify that. But where you're going and what you and I talk about is in your network days, if you realized that a packet was malicious or bad, what could you do? You can't really block the packet because you don't know the business outcome. You don't know the impact to the business. And so therefore you got to engage security teams. You got to do analysis. You got to talk to the business. And then 5 days later, if you're lucky, you might be able to realize what to do to stop the attack. Okay. And much of our analysis is forensic on logs. So it's, 150 days old before we get there. Right. Well, the beauty for what we're doing here with identity is at the point we determine that the identity may be compromised. Okay. We can block the attack. We can just deprovision Russ for 15 minutes so that he can't log in. Right. And then we can do more investigation and then we can apologize and give it back. Okay.
Absolutely.
We can block a transaction. Okay. And hold it and then let the transaction through again later if we need to. So the beauty here is it's not just we identify an incident and then we have to go do investigation. It's we identify an incident, we can implement immediate containment in a way that we can describe to the business how it's not going to prevent business. It may impact it, right? Russ, you may go, oh man, I can't log into this application. I have to do it manually. But what I tell everybody is IT has done us a favor because IT systems come down all the time.
Yeah.
And so we all know the manual processes that we service to be able to get the job done to sell more jeans. And so the beauty here is what you're doing with Nudge and others is you can take action. You cannot just tell me something, but you can do something for me to give me some immediate breath, right? To take a look a little further. And so you're thwarting the attack temporarily, letting the business still occur, and then coming back to bear depending upon how important, or once you do the analysis, if it really is a breach, then I can do further containment, but we've introduced resiliency. There's that last line of defense, okay, that has eluded us for all these years in how we're trying to be able to look at our data and do near real time authentication, authorization, containment.
Steve, we could talk all day, and we have in the past. So I'm going to have to let you go for now. It's been a pleasure to talk with you today. Please join us in the future for future episodes of Overshadowed. Thank you so much, Steve.
Absolutely. Thank you, Russell. And thank you, audience. I appreciated the opportunity to kind of share my thoughts and for you to hear what Russ and I talk about, right? To be able to make Nudge part of the solution.
Appreciate that.